If you are a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. This is such a simple, silly proverb. It hardly bears repeating. But when we look at how many big-name reporters have been caught lying about violence, this simple, silly proverb might be the best way to describe journalism in America. And it's not greed on their part, trying to sell more ads with violent headlines. It's just human nature. People want to be respected in their field. In 2003, Brian Williams was caught lying about being shot down in a helicopter in Iraq. Brian Williams, by the way, is a respected journalist with 12 documentary awards, including an Emmy and a Walter Cronkite Award and 6 honorary degrees. In 2011, Mike Tobin, reporting for Fox News, claimed he was punched during a union protest in Wisconsin. The protesters had caught sight of Tobin and the Fox News team and changed their chant to "Fox News lies." That was when Tobin told the news station he was being assaulted. Later, when the video was leaked, assaulted got walked back to punched in the arm like a sibling, which then got downgraded again by Tobin to tapped on the arm accidentally. Laura Logan and Jonathan Karl, CBS and ABC respectively, both got caught inventing violent stories from Benghazi. Laura was a host of 60 Minutes, and Jonathan was the chief White House correspondent. Tucker Carlson of Fox News claimed that more children died in bathtubs than gun accidents, which is objectively untrue. And Hannity used the people charged with graffiti in his tally of violent criminals during the Portland protest, which, if you saw the footage of the protest, that's a lot of graffiti. Each incident of spray painting was not itself an assault. Finally, there's Bob Woodward himself, the man who's been called a deity of journalism. Woodward, the Woodward, who caught Nixon in the Watergate scandal, claimed back in 2013 that a White House advisor, Gene Sperling, threatened him with violence. If you want the whole quote, you can find it in our show notes. To be brief, Gene Sperling told the most powerful journalist on the planet, "You'll regret making this claim." And Bob Woodward chose to interpret that as Sperling promising violent retribution. Conan O'Brien thought it was such a joke, he poked fun at Woodward and the feeling threatened incident during a White House Correspondents' Dinner. Woodward, of course, has won every award in journalism. And of the 20 nonfiction books he's co-authored, 18 became national bestsellers. Our point is, if the only time you got a food pellet from the universe was when you hit a blinking red button that said, "Violent news," wouldn't you hit it? If journalists are trained to look for violence, they get rewarded when their violent stories air on the 5 o'clock news and receive literal lifetime awards for having experienced violence up close. Why would you ever report on anything else? In other words, if you feel like America's not making progress, if it doesn't seem like we're building something amazing, it might be because we're not asking the architects or engineers a damn thing. We're asking the hammers, how are things looking? And of course the answer is, there sure are a lot of nails out here, guys. You're listening to The Re-Engineered You. This is a podcast about self-empowerment and all the myths, lies, and misconceptions we tell ourselves. Then we use science and history to bust those myths and re-engineer a better you. I'm your host, Todd Lemense, the extrovert.
And I'm the writer, researcher, and introvert, Joe Anthony, whose job it is to dig through the outer layer of no-duh on the internet and get to the facts.
The purpose of today's episode is not to discredit journalism. As a nation, we need good journalism. The more working, paid, investigative journalists we have, the more oversight we have in every corner of America, from politics to business to consumerism. Our front windshield into progress hinges on journalism. News media is our window of America as a whole. However, here at the Reengineered You, we will say that if we see nothing but shootings in the news, we may start to think America is just a big old bucket of guns and bodies. If we only ever see lottery winners being interviewed and never losers, we'll subconsciously think our chances of winning aren't that bad. And if the only footage that gets airtime for months on end is burning buildings and violence, we'll start prepping our doomsday bunkers. So today, we want to report on the real state of things in a very unjournalistic way. And we're going to start with a few myths. Myth 1. The news is just a small piece of Americans' progress pie. So why focus on journalism in an episode about progress? Myth 2. Why don't we have a public access news station like what AP News is supposed to be? Why do news stations have to pick political sides and make America look like an apocalypse to be financially viable? Myth 3. How bad is the world really? Has progress in America truly stalled? Or are we just trying to interpret our progress through the outbreaks and tear gas that dominate the news? This will be part 1 of a 2-part series about progress in America. In this part, we'll discuss the biases we all share and why watching the evening news might make it seem like progress has come to a grinding halt. Then in part 2, we'll talk about better ways to measure progress other than the violence we see on CNN or Fox. Now we're going to go way back. We'll go back to the colonial period in America. And that was 1607 to 1776. And news was spread very differently back then, Joe. Guess how news was spread?
I'm guessing like somebody would feed a note to a trout, send it downstream, and then somebody would catch that trout and like pull it out and read it.
That's pretty damn close. Mouth to mouth and letter to letter. So, you'd write a letter to somebody and then they would go to like the town center and tell everybody.
Dearest sir, things are not good.
Yeah, it'd be hard to gossip about people back then. And church was a big one. So people weren't reading the newspaper. People, I thought it was a newspaper, but the news would have been 2 months old or something, right?
Right. And that makes sense because if the only time everybody in the community comes together to like meet, the church is news.
How families used to spend time together. After dinner in the colonial period, they would all sit around the fire, all the lamps lit up, and they would read as a family.
Okay.
Now, the literacy rate was very low then, Joe. About 30% of the people could actually read. So I'm guessing that whoever was the most educated of the kids or who had the best voiceover would be the entertainment for the evening.
So our modern version is whoever can read reads the Amazon reviews for everybody else.
I would think it would be a lot of fun, wouldn't it, to share the same story? It's kind of like when you all go to the movies as a family, and you get out and you say, which part did you like? Which part did you like? But only with a book, it'd be continued over a week or so.
I almost got excited until I realized what they were reading. I've read books from that period, and they're kind of tame. So
dry.
Yeah. It's not like they're asking, like, what do you think about Spider-Man? Can Hulk lift Thor's hammer? They're not having that discussion.
There's no sex in there because that's all sin, right?
Right.
So then fast forward, the radio is invented. And this is very exciting. So the family after dinner, they have electricity now. They go in the living room. They listen to music that stirs up emotions. They also had sports, which I know you would enjoy, where they did play-by-play, where they described every single play in detail, so you felt like you were there. You had to use your imagination. But one of the most popular things they had were shows. Like the Lone Ranger, where they were suspense, and he fall off the cliff at the end, and you wonder if he lived, so you have to tune in next week.
Right, the literal cliffhanger.
Now, we get into television. And television, of course, was a monster hit. And they had things for everybody, and it was going all day long. Early in the day, they'd have the soap operas, the drama. Then they'd have the news channels. And the news anchors, Joe, were world life celebrities. They were people that everyone trusted, that knew everything, all-knowing.
Right. And they presented this objective front. Like when they talked about the news, they tried to represent both sides. They were super calm about everything. They didn't get no fluster, no rile.
And no personal agenda. So people are watching, after they watch the news, sports are on, so they get to watch sports from all over the world. And then at night as a family, there's the sitcoms. Gilligan's Island, MASH, Twilight Show, whatever you want. The family would sit around and watch that together. Back in the day, Joe, we didn't have TVs in 5 different rooms. We didn't.
Right.
We watched TV together. We watched the same thing. There was no remote. The remote was the youngest kid.
Right.
So go change the fucking channel.
Get up.
You hit him in the back of the head. Channel 8.
Right. And there was no, as far as there wasn't much politicizing because there was just a view. And then the first time we actually had 2 views on television, 2 political views. It was the 1960 debate between Kennedy and Nixon. So before that, it was really them trying to be objective as far as I could tell.
And it's very common nowadays for sitcoms to have a side.
Yes, absolutely.
Based on what the producers and writers and that station is trying to blue or red.
Right.
And last but not least, we fast forward today. And we're in the internet age. Now, this is you can watch whatever you want right now. And you can get news from anywhere in the world right now. And this is so not everyone has to agree on things. We can all have our own opinion. As a family, we don't all think the same thing. We're not listening to the same propaganda.
Right. Now, do you personally, before we get into all the science and all the history, do you think that's a better world? Like just out of your gut reaction, top of your head.
To be an individual, right? Have your own opinion, your own experiences.
Dad is watching political news while the kid is sitting there with a tablet watching cartoons on YouTube.
No, I don't think it is. And on the political front and the experience and what's happening in the world, you're just hearing from other people what's happening. You're not discovering what's happening from your own being out in the world. It's just fed to you.
Right. Before we launch into basically our study of journalism and how it reflects progress or does it reflect progress, I kind of want to talk about a little, how do you feel about the notion that we get together and we watch television, but oftentimes we're not watching an event happen. We're watching people's reactions to an event, or we're watching their reactions to people's reactions to an event.
This is what you talk about a lot. You talk about moral outrage.
Yeah, exactly. One of the most egregious examples of this, if you watch CNN or Fox News, I have watched both channels do this thing where they will say, we're going to get on Twitter and see what Twitter thinks about this. And they'll look at people's Twitter feed about an event, and then they will discuss it. So you're not watching news, you are watching the news anchors' reactions to the public's reactions to an event that they're not there for.
Well, they're taking that opinion and running with it.
Right, it's
whichever direction they want to run.
It's a snowball of outrage. Yeah.
And those people can't debate because they're just tweets on.
Right. Yeah, any points they bring up, it's fair game, because it's not like somebody's going to be like, hello, I'm Sam873 and you have misrepresented me. Like, you're not going to call in because your tweet got talked about on CNN.
Now, talking about family spending time together, we talked about in the beginning reading the books, all hanging on every word, the only entertainment you have. Now, let's say you go out to eat, local restaurant over here, the Ram. You see a family of 7 people. Every single one of them, mom, dad, grandma, are all hunched over, staring at their phone. Not looking at the same thing, not texting and talking about the same subject. Literally not together.
Have you been to a lunch where they have the policy of no phones out?
No, never. You mean the family decision or the restaurant?
Oh, I mean like groups of friends, business meetings, things like that.
Oh, absolutely. And business, that's a sign that you're in a serious meeting in my world.
Right.
Phones are nowhere in sight.
Okay.
All right, Joe. Let's play a hypothetical game. Let's create. Now, we've been careful on the show not to tip our hand. We're both non-political. We try not to be blue or red, even with our opinions. If we started our own news broadcast, what would it look like if it really, really accurately represented us?
Journalists would be required to wear masks, Halloween masks specifically, so you didn't know what their facial expression was when they reported on left or right wing issues. No colors like red or blue, so it's going to be a gray screen. I'm kidding. These are all joke methods to cover up biases. Because apparently in studies they found that if you go back and look at journalists from the golden era we're talking about, you could actually tell what Walter Cronkite or journalists before him, who they sided with politically, depending on the speed or rate they spoke at, or like micro expressions. So even if you're not political, you can still tell what side somebody is on just a little bit.
The pros will get that stern, fatherly voice.
Right. So we want to not just have politically independent people reporting, people who haven't sports teamed their own political side. Like, nobody's under a red or blue banner waving a flag. They're just like, okay, we're just here for the reporting. We also want to represent by time. So, like, how many articles do we put out? We mentioned in our opening that people would be represented accurately with lottery. Like, if you win the lottery, you get on the news. Well, what about all those losers? We don't show the thousands of lottery losers.
Or the 5 million of them, you mean?
Right, exactly. So I assume that if we're starting our journalism school or our broadcast, we would have to represent things accurately. Our data today, by the way, check out our show links, because we have this from DART, which is a project of Columbia Journalism School, and it's run by psychologists from the University of Tulsa. So they have a bunch of really great statistics on what people actually report on versus what actually happens. So you want to go through a couple of those just as an example to let people know how lopsided the reporting is?
Yeah. In Los Angeles, 80% of local murders get reported by the Times, the LA Times. Only 2% of local physical and sexual assaults get reported. So 80%, 2%.
Right. If I was living there, I would think that murder is how you greet your neighbor in the morning, and then, physical and sexual assault never happen.
So meaning if our re-engineered news program was in LA, if we wanted to show a murder victim during the 5 o'clock broadcast, we'd have to show a parade of assault victims, one after another, to accurately represent what type of crimes are out there. To show that the vast majority of violent crimes are assaults, not murders. Next, analysts of 175 crime articles in Time magazine showed that although 73% of the stories were about violent crimes, only about 10% of the crimes reported to police actually involved violence.
So, if we want to put things into perspective, we are starting our own broadcast. We're going to make everybody, just by repetition, make them feel things are accurate. When you say that 10% of crimes involve violence, that means that, say we wanted to, okay, so let's go with murder, because murder is the one that we see in the news most often. Of violent crimes, that's the one where, like, the news program will spend, they'll break down who was murdered, where, how it happened, who's at large, things like that. So if we went with, let's see, for every local murder, I looked it up just because after we put that into the doc, I was like, okay, well, how many larcenies, how many thefts would we have to report? 310. So for every murder, there are 310 thefts or larcenies. So if we spent only 60 seconds talking about a chilling stabbing to boost our ratings would eventually plummet, because then we'd have to spend, and this is just representation, 60 seconds of murder means we'd spend 5 hours talking about all the boring stuff that got stolen during the day.
We're talking about Walmart shoplifting, someone whose car got broken into. That's what thefts mean.
Yeah, not even the exciting thefts, like smashing a car window. Yeah. We would wish a story about a broken window came up.
These aren't Fast and Furious car chases here.
No, this is not Ocean's 11. What we'd be listening to is like somebody had a box stolen from their front door. And that would give us a fair representation. So, yeah, sit through 5 boring hours of minor theft for 60 seconds of somebody being murdered. I noticed that there was a trend in podcasting, by the way, and this holds true for news too. In the last couple of years, have you noticed that news organizations that used to represent themselves as fairly neutral started picking political sides?
Oh, absolutely. Along with, like I said, the TV shows and the whole channels.
Yeah. I used to not know what political side CNN was on. Like, I had no idea. And if I tuned into Fox like 15 years ago, I would have thought that they were just apolitical. I would have thought they were like AP News, where they didn't have a side at all.
Well, no, I think about that with CNN when they started in the Gulf War. And
right.
They were just reporting what happened.
Yeah, and if they were caught picking political sides, it was a bad thing. It was almost like they had been caught being inaccurate. So that idea of a political news, a network that doesn't have a political side, that is publicly funded, the reason we say publicly funded is because the people who are buying ad space, they have a political side too. Do you remember when Fox News, they said something, that there was some political kerfuffle, like they said something their base didn't like, their right-wing Trump-supporting base didn't like, and they started blowing up coolers to show that they weren't... What happened with that? Do you remember that?
Was that the Yeti coolers?
Exactly, yeah, it was the Yeti coolers. Okay, we just... we looked it up real quick just because we didn't want to... this is very germane to us talking about how news gets funded. The NRA, which is a direct pipeline to a lot of sort of companies, and they have so much political support. There are a couple of advertisers that want to distance themselves from the NRA after the Parkland shooting back in 2018. And the banks, rental car agencies, and airlines that severed with the NRA, they pissed off people on the right who wanted to show support for gun rights. If you take an issue like, I want to own a rifle, and then you're able to get so entrenched in your news organization that somebody upsets an organization that represents the thing you love, so you blow up something that's being advertised by the people who pay for the news for the thing you love. If you're not in the thick of it, that's how convoluted it looks from the outside. Like if you're not in the political know, if you don't have your friend at work coming up to you and being like, Yeti said something bad about somebody we support, which is the NRA. If you're not in that direct chain of conversation, if you just zoom out politically and look at it as here's how the money swims in a circle, then it looks as complicated as that. So somebody who is non-political like me, I look at it from the outside and I'm like, okay, so the NRA doesn't support a thing that's being advertised by a company. So I'm not going to do that whole thing again, but you know what I'm saying. Like it's...
Absolutely. And Yeti just doesn't want kids to get shot at school.
Right.
Doesn't mean they're not still conservative. Doesn't mean they don't support a lot of other conservative causes.
Right. In the end, what we're looking at is news organizations and advertisers will follow what is financially viable, period. If something goes against their political base, but not doing it would make them lose all of the money, if they just can't advertise because it's connected to something negative, they're going to go with the money. Like, they're not going to side with a political base. They're going to go with what keeps their company afloat. So when we talk about the idea of a public news, by the way, there's a guy, Dan Carlin. He has the podcast Common Sense and Hardcore History. He's the first one I heard of talking about the idea of what if we took advertising out of it entirely? What if it was, taken out of taxes? Sorry, libertarians who are listening. And what if it was a publicly funded news network and they specifically hired people that did not have a political leaning? What would that look like? And then we would get what we're talking about. We would get 310 thefts reported for every one murder. So we're now at, this will be edited, but we're at 30 minutes now and we're getting to our first point about how do we measure progress in America. Because ultimately, this is not a show about just journalism. We want to look at TV makes us think things are going bad and that America is blowing up. How bad is it really? That's the question we're asking today, right?
It is. I think we've got most of our rants out of our system at this point. we might reserve space for maybe two more.
Right. That is why we're splitting this into two parts. When we first looked at this episode as an outline, it was like, this is going to be multiple parts because we have a lot of complaints. I guess political neutral folk like me and Todd, we have a lot of complaints about the way news is run nowadays. So we're going to try not to just turn this into a rant about how hard it is to find reliable news.
If you ever want to hear us on moral outrage, listen to any of our wage theft episodes.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Anytime we talk wages or the economy. Speaking of economy, that is how a lot of companies measure progress in America. GDP, gross domestic product. For your money, personally, does the health of the economy, businesses and how quickly they expand year by year, is that your progress is that your measure for American progress?
I think it is. I think it's people being financially secure, and I think it's easier with money because you can measure it.
It's measured every day. Yeah. I actually think that's why GDP is used to measure progress so often, is because it is very easy to measure. Why measure anything else if you have this yardstick put in the paper? I mean, literally, the Dow Jones and the stock is put in the paper every single day. So it's easy to be like, are we doing progress? And then you just point to a yardstick that lands at your front door every morning, and you're like, hey, there it is. There's progress.
For you personally, how do you measure it? So if you took gross, everything were create, sell, low crime rate, what do you see? Where are you at in between that?
I'm a nut job, and I don't think that the model that companies have to expand every year is a good model. I actually think of progress based on the plague. In the, like, I go back to the 1600s. Infant mortality, quality of living. We've had so many episodes about happiness, and that the peak happiness is between 80,000 a year and 120,000 a year. That's kind of my measure, is how healthy is the population, how educated are they finding fulfillment within their period of life. I don't give a shit if the Dow Jones is doing well, and I don't really care if how over or underpriced certain markets are. As long as it's not crashing and burning, and I can buy cereal in the cereal aisle without it costing $300 a box. If we are living longer and we are finding happiness in life and we can get medical coverage, I feel like that is progress.
Ben Franklin always said that people's comfort, quality of life, is found in daily conveniences, comfort. And when he was talking about that, he was one of the first to really get behind streetlights for people when they're walking at night and stuff. He said it's in the daily comforts, the quality of life, and not the lottery winning windfalls.
Right. Yeah. If we take Ben Franklin's words and stretch them to today, I don't view the quality of life in America, I don't view progress in America as, oh, look, a car company is booming. Tesla is hitting this peak. I actually view quality of life by what you said. When I meet people in the street, did they get health coverage last year? Most news sources, and this is kind of a teaser for our second half of this show, most news sources really seem to focus on crime being the best measure of progress. They seem to really focus on, is it a violent day? If not, then we're progressing. Have we seen violence lately? Okay, well, then we're not progressing. So it's kind of like our hammer and nail question. Why do Americans measure progress by what the news shows them? If you and I are talking about the best measures being GDP or infant mortality, why are we so invested in the idea that progress is tied to violence?
Where do you put the education, how educated we are for lowering the crime rate?
See, that is something that's I've kind of skewed in the last couple of years or a couple decades, because if it used to be progress could be measured by how many people are educated in a nation, that's become mixed together because of the internet. I can meet somebody on the bus who is well-spoken, well-educated, up-to-date on news, talks politics, and then find out that they don't have a degree at all. They barely graduated high school, but they're just online all the time.
That's an Elon Musk exceptional person.
Exactly. Yeah. That is a uneducated, no college education, but still eloquent, still up to date. So you can actually have a pretty good bead on what's happening. But I completely agree with you. Any other era or decade or generation we lived in, I would totally, education would be my number one for how progress is going.
But I see what you're saying. It's not how many people got their bachelor's or associates or graduated from a trade school. It's all over the place.
Right. How many times have you bought lottery tickets in the past?
Oh man, when I only buy them when it's one of those monster ones. When I start seeing on the news that it's a 60, 70, 80 million, I'll go down there and stand in line, and I get excited. I feel like I've won when I'm in line. I'm planning on quitting my job, getting a couple girlfriends,
here's the
traveling the world.
Here are the tigers I'm going to own. I do the kind of the opposite. Our family has a poor tradition of, we don't buy lottery tickets when the Powerball goes up. We get scratch-its for people's birthdays. So you might get a card and a couple scratch-its will come in it instead of a $5 bill. And that's more exciting because you don't know what's going to happen.
You might win $10,000. It might be a $10,000 present.
Right, exactly. Have you ever, by the way, we're about to, if anyone is really into the lottery, We're about to crap all over it as an institute. Have you ever heard of the term survivorship bias and availability bias?
I have not, but I want to talk about my grandmother for a quick second.
Oh, yeah.
She played the same lottery numbers every week for 60 years. She wrote them down. Well, she'd have to write them down after year, thinking that someday her ship would come in on those numbers.
Okay. I like that consistency. I know there are people that like pick different numbers every week, or they have like a list of birthdays they play. I like the idea that you're just going to stick with the same casino machine. You're going to stick with the same number. You know, your thing will pay off if you're consistent. So a survivorship bias or availability bias, we're going to mix the two together. They're two different phenomenons, but we're just going to talk about them a little bit mixed up here for a second. Both are kind of mental shortcuts. And they come from sort of evolution handing us an easy card. What they do is they rely on sort of examples or concepts or methods to help us so that we don't need to listen to absolutely everything all the time. What I mean by that is, if you are ancient man and you hear somebody in the cave talking about how they survived a lion attack, you need to pay attention. Because if somebody in your cave survived a lion attack, that means there's a lion outside. That's not they are talking about a lion that once came out sometime long ago. That means it just happened.
They're not bragging in a bar here.
Right. When we were talking about how your news came from church and it was colonial times, news didn't spread more than about 30 miles unless somebody really put effort into it. Unless somebody got on a horse, grabbed a message, started writing, news spread at how far you could walk in a day. And just for fun, I looked up how far a lion's hunting ground was. Apparently it's 8 to 250 miles, depending on how hungry they are.
Close enough to get you then.
Right. So our brain is built to have a heavier bias toward things that we hear and things that we hear very regularly. So the more often you hear somebody in the cave complaining about lions attacking recently, then your number goes up. Like, you start thinking you're going to see a lion soon. And that is a good thing. That is something evolution has given us to be like, okay, this is really important. Pay attention, please. You're going to die if you don't.
But right now we're just lambasted in all kinds of bad information between social media and the news. Back in those days, it was shelter, danger, and food. Mm-hmm. That's the only thing that was worth talking about.
Exactly. See, that's what these biases really are pointing to, is if something can be recalled in your recent memory, it must be important. But to remind everybody who's listening, if there are 310 thefts for every murder we hear about, you don't need to worry about murders nearly as much as you need to worry about bringing in your Amazon box from your front porch, because there's been 310 of those stolen recently for every one stabbing. So we're ignoring the cavemen in our cave who are constantly talking about how their stuff gets stolen from each other, by each other, and we're only focusing on, hey, did you hear about the lion? Lottery works the same way. If they had lottery losers, what do you think the lottery would look like if every time they showed one lottery winner, they showed every loser and gave them the exact same amount of interview time on the news?
The moan of defeat, them tearing the tickets up, them threatening their grandchildren because they didn't play the exact numbers that they told them to play.
Right.
Rest in peace, Grandma.
Right. Grandma would expire before the next lottery came up. Like, she'd be still watching the losers because it would just go on for so long. If the lottery, heck, if banks worked on the same logic, if we marched every loser out on TV every night, if every one winner was accompanied by 1 million losers on TV, nobody would ever play the lottery ever again. Like, it would just, everybody would know it is a tax on, people who don't think things out.
It would water down that whole thing.
Right.
Or wash it all the way out.
Right. This is also kind of this plays with the mere exposure effect, which is something we have covered on multiple episodes. And it's how propaganda works. It just means that if you get something repeated at you, you will start. It's like our lion example. If you hear over and over again that something's happening from the news or from advertisers or from really anything, it'll be on your mind. Todd, do you have people send you news articles on like Facebook and stuff?
All day, every day.
Because I have gotten away from TV, like I reserve my TV time for garbage on Netflix. I don't actually see TV news anymore. When you get stuff on Facebook, like when people send you clips, or actually when people send you outrage articles, do you actually click on them?
I do. And I hate myself for doing it while I'm doing it.
Okay. I love it. I mean, I do hate myself because I'm about to read something that is biased and skewed and comes from a political bubble.
So extreme and so blown out of context.
I still feel good doing it. I still feel good clicking it because usually the headlines are wild. This is, by the way, we're going to talk a little bit about, this is a article about news biases, thanks to social media. And this is by Indiana University, if you want to look up our links. You and I, Todd, we have talked about how people trust headlines and they trust who made the headline very often. You and I are huge fans of Malcolm Gladwell.
Oh, yeah.
And I used to trust, I mean, literally everything he wrote until I saw a podcast series he did, which was a 6-part episode, or a 6-part series. And I started listening. I was like, this is going to be so good. And then it was just an ad for Lexus. It was a 6-part podcast series, and it was every episode was an ad for Lexus cars. It's so crazy.
So even this academic journalist that we look up to as being brilliant and well researched doesn't care. He cares more about money. He's for hire.
Here's his version of the Yeti cooler. Yeah, he is for hire. This Indiana University study, it boils down to people are extraordinarily affected by the emotional connotation of a headline, even if it's not an indicator of what's in the article. I mean, like they may in the article, and I've seen this on both political sides, they may say in the article itself, you know, our headline is inaccurate. Here's the actual study. Here's the actual numbers. It doesn't matter though, because when we talk about how we have a bias toward things that are repeated and toward things that are emotional, all it takes is the headline. That's the big takeaway for me, is to realize that, you know, we don't need to hear all of the details about where the lion was found, what jungle it was found in, who ran into it, how they were making a lot of noise. We don't need to know any details. All we hear is the word lion, and it comes from somebody in our cave, and we are in. Like, that is what hooks us.
Well, on this is what happens now in social media, and this has probably been happening to me for years, but I haven't realized it, and it hasn't been this prevalent until this last election. I'm a 47-year-old white man, and I'll get all these friend requests from people who look almost exactly like me. You know, it's weird, and you think they look like they'd be my brother or one of my friends. So and then as soon as I like them, they are hitting me with conservative stuff, like you said, almost brainwashing me, radicalizing me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just like, oh, I should have known it. That guy looked too much like a Navy SEAL, somebody I'd want to be friends with. You know, he's mountain climbing and shit.
I get that from people I know. I mean, like I don't just get friend requests where I'm just like, here are a bunch of overweight writers like me. I get them where it's like, here are people I have actually gone to conferences with, and then like suddenly I'm watching them blow up my Facebook with all the political news that I could never want to read.
They just dump it on you like they don't know you.
Yeah, but it's because they're excited. Like they want to share something that emotionally hit them. So,
well, my guys are we're gonna go blow up Yetis together.
Yeah. You guys go blow up Yetis. We're gonna be crying about something that happened in the news. There is a system called Hoaxy, which itself sounds like a hoax. But Hoaxy is a system that they talked about in this article, where they tracked Twitter accounts that shared misinformation. And they found out that the way hoax news or bad news or like bad information spreads, you would think that like, okay, everything that gets published on Twitter or everything that gets published in news organizations, we assume it gets fed through almost like a washer machine that will check it for facts and then release it. Or like everything gets fed through Twitter and it's like going through like a copier or something. Like there is some machine that is humming that is checking all of these for good information.
And people are held accountable if it gets out there and it's not true. And those people get fired and go to prison if they're putting stuff out there that is not real news. Right.
But these articles, when we talk about misrepresentation and how it's just people in a cave shouting lion. They found out that from this Twitter system, Hoaxy, this analyst system, the bad information was almost completely cut off from any fact checker systems or correction systems. So like any machine or any automated system or any group of people that check for facts, these bad headlines that are being shared on our Facebook, they don't reach the light of day. It's like a bubble of gas down in the deep part of the ocean. It just sits there and it builds itself up over time. And then eventually we stumble across it when somebody, says, hey, look at that down at the ocean. You should go check that out. And then we follow a lantern down in the water, and then we're in the middle of a bubble that is all horrible things about blowing up Yetis.
And it's all fiction writing by Joe and his writing buddies.
It is, yeah. We make it all up. We sit around. So if you want to know who is making that bubble of gas down at the bottom of the ocean, the fake lion news, in this article they say, quote, "We found a very dense core group of accounts retweeting each other almost exclusively, including several bots." So
literally nobody's writing these.
Yeah, so literally it's a bubble of gas. It's just a bubble of fake news making itself, promoting itself, and then eventually when it bursts, that's when it's getting shared to you on Facebook. So when you get these wild headlines on Facebook, that is the bubble bursting and like the gas reaching you.
And you probably shouldn't be making life decisions on these.
No. And that's what people do. They see the headline and they're like, uh-oh, lions. By the way, if you are on Facebook, this is also from the article. I just want to quote this for us. If a user often clicks on Facebook links from a particular news source, Facebook will tend to show that person more of that site's content. This is old news. This has been stuff we've been talking about for 4 years now. This is also called the filter bubble. So I just want to point out with this episode, we're kind of guilty of doing this, by the way, of misrepresenting by time. And when we talk about one murder would be showing 310 thefts, by picking and choosing in our opening narrative instances where journalists were dishonest, we're kind of making them all look dishonest as a whole. And we want to point that out. Like, really, most of the people on our list, I mean, for God's sake, we had Bob Woodward on our list. The people on our list have careers of honesty and integrity behind them. But the point remains, we pay the most attention to violence. We pay the most attention to the guy in the cave that screams lion, and then we hand him money. So
yeah, they still mix the bad ones in with the good ones. Don't make them saints over there, Joe.
No, I won't. But yeah, the time that they are the most rewarded in life is when they scream lion.
Hey, but I lie sometimes too.
True. I think everyone does. Okay, so if I could just completely overuse the lion metaphor again and again, how common are lions? Like, when we talk about how bad it's gotten in America, if you ask me, violence has just gotten worse and worse and worse since FDR. Like violence is just, I mean, like, we're at the peak violence right now, right? We have to be based on the news.
Well, just based on your neighbors, based on your friends. They say nowadays you can't let your kids go out. Now they say it all the time. The history of violence in this country, we always say you can't be too careful nowadays. The world has absolutely gone to hell. But there's been a lot tougher times. And not that long ago, I've lived in all different kinds of neighborhoods and parts of this country. And I've lived in some bad areas. And I always wonder what causes violence. Is it poverty, or is it people trying to dominate other people? They want to become more powerful, more wealthy. And I've always wondered, in my life even, am I in more danger of being beat up, killed, than I was 10 years ago, or 10 years ago from that? What's the percentages, Joe?
Right. That is a really good question. And if I watch the news, I don't assume it's from poverty, because usually the news shows violence that is happening that is like crimes of passion or crimes that seem like they don't have a reason. Do you remember when the news articles came out about the blackout game?
No.
This was about 5 years ago. There was a rash of teens punching people in the head or the side of the face,
I saw the
cold cocking them.
Yeah, it was very sad.
Yeah. Apparently most of those were just made up. I mean, like not fully made up. They would take unrelated stories about people being punched out, or they would take footage from years before that weren't happening during those blackout game reportings. It kind of ended up being like the other stories about, look at what teens are into today. Aren't they wild? Apparently kind of falls into the same subheading of a lot of it was misreporting, misrepresentation.
No, I remember that, to the point that when teenagers would walk by me, I would kind of put my chin down.
I went the opposite way. I would tell them, let's go, let's do this. I'm ready. And just these kids who were coming back from high school, they had no idea what was wrong with me.
Well, this is the thing, too, about the crime and how like we are to a crime. Another thing is the population swelled. There's just more people in the world.
Right. So Todd and I are going to do the scared old white person thing. We're really just asking, how likely are we to get robbed leaving our house today? Turns out we're fine. I would love to. I would like this to be like a salacious news report where we're like, you have to be so afraid. There are so many lions out there, guys.
Keep in mind we live next to Intel, Salesforce.
Right. Yeah.
In yuppie land.
We're at most at risk of being bored while somebody tells us about their favorite Netflix show that is very, very dense on nerd stuff.
Or studying for their PhD.
Right. If you live in America, okay, so first off, we've got a PBS article that is in our doc, and we're going to share that out. Crime looks like it was invented in 1960. I mean, before that, the number is like half what it was then. So something happened after World War II to really get crime like really kicking.
PSD from the war, probably, right?
Yeah. Well, okay, there's lots and lots of theories. We're just going to very, very briefly gloss over them because we don't have time to make this into a crime podcast. There's theories that the exposure to that level of violence did it. There are theories that gun training did it for everybody. There are theories that consumerism did it. That if everybody is looking at their neighbors and being like, my God, they have a house, a car, a picket fence, and a working stove, and all that stuff is new from the factories. We had, after World War II, by the way, we had factories everywhere producing just a ton of, neat gadgets and it was the first time consumerism really took off. And so the thought is maybe everybody wanted more things. There's also theories about the 90s, like leaded gas. Maybe lead everywhere led to higher violent rates. If you go to Wiki about violence in the 90s and the 60s, there's yet more theories they quote. For whatever reason, crime exploded from like the 50s to the 60s. And we're just going to start covering from there. So this is, like Todd said, there's just more people. So we're doing this per capita. So every 100,000 people we are looking at in America, how many crimes get committed? So if you live in a town with 100,000 people, this is roughly about how many crimes you can expect. In 1960, there were 1,887 crimes per 100,000 people. So that's actually closer to 2 in every 100 people could expect to, see crime, be involved in crime. Like that's how many crimes are committed per 100. 1970, that explodes. That doubles between 1960 and 1970. So in 1970, for every 100,000 people, there are 3,980 crimes committed. That explodes again in 1980, goes up to about 6,000. It stays at about 6,000 crimes committed per every 100,000 from 1980 to 1990. So if we look at it in the big lens of the world, 1960, crime isn't invented. We always had it, but it goes nuts. 1970, it doubles from 60. It doubles again in 1980. And then 80 and 90 is our peak crime. Do you remember that news story about like the subway shooting in New York where like a bunch of kids showed up with like shivs, like they had screwdrivers and they attacked a guy on the subway, and the guy on the subway pulled out a revolver and shot them dead?
I do. Yeah, I remember that.
It was huge news in the 90s, and everybody who talked about how crazy crime was in the 90s, they point to that as like the changing incident. That was when people were like, the only thing that can stop bad people with guns is a good guy with a gun. That's like the NRA still points to that event as like the superseding event for, stopping crime with your own power, with your own gun. None of those guys on the subway had guns. That's something that gets left out of the story. They had screwdrivers. They had just been stealing from arcades and like taking, money from them. That's why they had the screwdrivers. And this guy had bought a gun and trained to use it specifically because his life was kind of going out of control. There's a whole dollop episode. And the way they put it on the dollop, I love it. They just said, this is a case of one asshole met on the subway with a bunch of other assholes, and some people ended up dead.
So he wasn't a Captain American hero is what you're saying.
Right. Whatever side you pick in that event, that is the 90s. That event. That is like the epitome of the 90s, the crime of the 80s and 90s and the peak. After that, whether it was people stopped using leaded gas or we ended up making consumer goods more available, whatever the reason, crime started dipping. It went from 90s at 6,000 per 100,000 people, 6,000 crimes per 100,000 people. It went down to 4,000. And then in 2010, it dipped again. It went down another 1,000. So 2010, we had 3,300 crimes for every 100,000 people. And then it dipped again. We are currently in 2020, according to the Disaster Center's statistics, we're at 2,500 crimes per 100,000 people.
So it's just as safe today as it was in the late 60s.
Exactly. We are looking at 60s level crime right now in America. And according to our earlier study we covered, most of it is theft. Almost all of it is people stealing out of each other's cars, people stealing boxes from each other's front porches. We are almost at, when you started this show and you were talking about the family gathered around watching TV, everyone's watching the same thing, everybody's listening to the radio, we are almost at that level of crime again. And yet the news is constantly reporting on lions. We're all going to die because everybody's walking around with a gun.
The very visible one I see, Joe, and it drives me crazy, is when I see these kids at the bus stop with their parents. And these are all the people with, you can't let your kids go to the bus. Crime is trending down. There were bad guys in the olden days, too, especially the 90s.
Right.
It's all in their head.
Generally speaking, and we're going to pull this from yet another source because we don't want to be inaccurate on any of this. If you look at macro trends, crime has been going down. Life expectancy has been increasing steadily for everyone across the board since 1950. So when we talk about progress, Hillary Clinton's slogan, the whole arrow moving forward, progress in America, make America great again from Trump. It doesn't matter what political aisle you land on. Statistics say we're doing pretty damn good. Crime is almost 1960s level, and our life expectancy has been just steadily going up like a line. So we're fine.
Not Joe and I. Our poor health is going to bring the average down.
No, we do the show. Every time we come in here, it's like we sipped from the wrong grail every time we record. Our hair is turning gray and falling out right now.
We talk about our cardiologist even though we're young men.
We're like those old guys that sit and play chess, and we're just feeding pigeons.
You've been listening to The Re-Engineered You. Thank you so much for listening to the show. You mean the world to us. We have a new episode every week. This has been part 1 of our breakdown on progress in America and how journalism interprets progress. Next week will be part 2, where we'll discuss better measurements for progress, which we might eventually start using if the internet goes the way we think it will.
You can also connect with us at www.re-engineeredyou.com. We appreciate feedback, and we love spirited debates. And please come check out our show notes, especially for this show. We have all of our statistics and everything available for you there.
We're not experts in anything, but we've got an opinion on everything.